Hello, it's Matthew here from the Nations of Sanity Project, a project that's based on the assertion that crime and law can and should be defined by the concept of individual self-ownership and established as the terms of a peace agreement. Now, for this video, I want to talk about property rights and what property rights are. Now, obviously, sort of alluded to by the name, property rights involves the right to own property. Now, what property rights actually comes from is the concept of individual self-ownership, which is obviously the concept I represent through the Nations of Sanity Project. And basically, it's quite a simple kind of logical progression. If we have right over only our own selves, then our right to acquire property is dependent on first use principles. So imagine you're in the wilderness, no one owns anything, but everyone has right over only themselves. And you come across a wild tree full of apples, and you pick one of those apples. You didn't have to aggress against anybody to do that. It was a wild tree, it didn't belong to anybody else, and you pick that apple. No aggression there, no violation of anybody else's individual self-ownership. But if somebody else was to come along and take the apple that you've already picked, that you are now in possession of, that you have now claimed as your own, that would be aggression. They would have to take that from you. They would have to aggress against you, which would be a violation of your individual self-ownership. So this is how, although property ownership can be transferred and further ratified through trade and creation, like if you build a house, it's your house, but that is dependent on you owning the materials first. If you buy property from somebody, then it's now your property, but that is still dependent on it being rightfully their property so that they had the right to then sell it on to you. And if we trace property ownership back to its origins, it always comes down to first use principle. Whoever acquired that piece of material first is the rightful owner of it. And first use principles just comes back to the concept of individual self-ownership, because obviously if we all have equal right over our own selves, then whoever goes and stands in a spot first is the person who has the right to stand in that spot. Whoever goes and takes some raw material from the natural shared environment that we all have a right to use. Whoever takes a particular piece of material, whether it's to build something else or whether it's just to use that material as it is, the person who does that first is the rightful owner, and anybody who tries to take that from them are a criminal aggressor who may well be able to gain possession of the particular piece of property if they have enough force behind them to do so, but they wouldn't be the rightful owner. And that's the difference between possession of property and ownership of property when we're talking about your moral rights. Like if someone steals my car, they would be in possession of it, but they're not the rightful owner. The rightful owner of the car would be me, because I'm the person who acquired it through voluntary trade in accordance with individual self-ownership. So that's what property rights are. Property rights is essentially our right to exclude others, and it only applies to our rightfully owned property. And we can properly identify what is our rightfully owned property through first use principles. As I say, creation and voluntary trade are additional ways to transfer and further ratify our property ownership, but at its source, property ownership is based on first use principles, and those first use principles are based on individual self-ownership. And that's the crux of what I want to get through to people in this video, is that everything comes back to individual self-ownership. And that is why the Nations of Sanity Project presents the solution to establish this concept of individual self-ownership as what defines law and crime, and establish that law as the terms of peace between all people, as the terms of a peace agreement. So not only does the concept of individual self-ownership provide an objective definition for what is and is not a crime and what the law should be, and it also defines our rights and freedom, which also informs us as to what is a crime and what is not a crime, because if we're acting within our rights, then we're not committing a crime, and if we're violating rights, then we are committing a crime according to that concept. But the other thing the concept of individual self-ownership does is it helps us ratify rightful ownership of property. It tells us how we can rightfully acquire property ownership versus invalid claims of ownership where self-ownership has been violated. So I hope that all makes sense, and I hope the concept of property rights is clearer to you after listening to this video. If anyone has any queries or questions or disagreements or anything else they want to say, then I'm always open to that. Please contact me, leave a comment, or contact me via my website, nationsofsanity.com, or leave a comment on one of our videos at Nations of Sanity YouTube channel. Thank you for listening.